What if the oldest surviving language in Western Europe is not simply a language at all, but the last audible trace of an Ice Age refuge, a human world that survived when the continent froze, endured when populations vanished, absorbed farmers without disappearing, and then held its identity behind the mountains while the rest of Iberia was rewritten again and again by conquest, migration, and empire. The Basque language, Euskara, sits in Europe like a stone from another age. It is not Celtic, it is not Latin, it is not Germanic, it is not Indo-European at all. It stands alone, surrounded by languages that belong to a vast family stretching from Ireland to India, yet refusing to fit inside that family, as if it had been left behind by an older Europe that everyone else forgot. For generations, this mystery invited a simple and seductive answer. The Basques were the last Paleolithic Europeans, the direct descendants of the cave painters and mammoth hunters, a people unchanged since the Deep Stone Age. But ancient DNA has made the story stranger, not simpler, because the evidence does not show a frozen tribe preserved without change. It shows layers, survival, replacement, mixture, and then a remarkable act of cultural endurance. It shows a people shaped not by one ancient origin, but by a long chain of survival, stretching from the frozen caves of Cantabria to the green valleys of the Western Pyrenees. The figure who gives this story its deepest human face is not a king, not a warrior, not a named ancestor from myth, but a woman buried nearly 19,000 years ago in northern Spain. She is known as the Red Lady of El Miron, although she was not elderly in the way the name suggests, and she was not Basque in any strict historical sense. She lived long before the Basque people existed as a recognizable group, long before farming entered Iberia, long before copper, bronze, iron, Rome, Christianity, or the kingdoms of medieval Europe. Yet her body was placed in a cave overlooking the valleys and mountains of Cantabria, within the same broad Atlantic corridor that later framed the Basque world. Her bones were stained with red ochre, the mineral color of ritual, blood, death, and return. Around her was the landscape of the Magdalenian world, the great Ice Age culture of Western Europe, famous for its cave art, its bone tools, its reindeer and horse hunters, and its astonishing ability to survive in a continent still recovering from the coldest phase of the last glacial age. She stands at the beginning of the story not because she was the first Basque, but because she belonged to the human refuge that made the later Basque story possible. To understand why El Miron matters, one has to picture Western Europe during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of the north and the livable heart of the continent contracted into scattered refugia. Europe was not a continuous human homeland in the way it looks on a modern map. Large regions became empty or nearly empty, too cold, too dry, too unstable, or too exposed. Human life withdrew toward the south and west, into Iberia, southern France, Italy, the Balkans, and other pockets where food, shelter, and seasonal movement still offered a chance. The Franco-Cantabrian region, stretching from southwestern France across the northern Spanish coast, became one of the most important of these refugia. Its caves held not just shelter but memory. Its valleys opened towards the Atlantic. Its mountains created barriers and corridors at the same time. It was a hard landscape, but not a dead one. Reindeer, red deer, horses, ibex, fish, birds, and coastal resources formed a world in which small human groups could endure while other populations vanished from the map. This is where the old idea of the Basques as Paleolithic survivors gets both its power and its danger. The power is obvious. The Basque homeland lies near one of the greatest Ice Age refugia in Europe. a region packed with decorated caves, ancient burials, and long-term human occupation. The danger is that survival is not the same as purity. No population in Europe passed through the last 20,000 years untouched. The people who lived around El Miron were not sealed in amber. They were part of changing networks of hunters, foragers, and later farmers. Their descendants, relatives, and successors mixed with newcomers. Their genetic profile shifted. Their languages changed or vanished. Their identities were remade. Yet the deep fact remains. Iberia preserved lineages that disappeared or were transformed elsewhere. In that sense, El Miron is not a fossil label slapped onto the Basques. She is a signpost pointing toward the older population landscape beneath them, the buried western layer of Europe. Her genome is especially important because it belongs to a moment after the worst cold, but before the great reshuffling that followed. Studies of Ice Age and post-Ice Age Europeans show that Western hunter-gatherer ancestry was not a single simple block. There were older Magdalenian-related groups, including populations associated with the Franco-Cantabrian refuge, and later hunter-gatherer ancestries connected to groups that expanded after the ice retreated. Iberia preserved a mixture of these strands. El Miron carried ancestry linked to the older Magdalenian Western European world, and later Iberian hunter-gatherers carried combinations of this deep Western ancestry with ancestry related to post-glacial hunter-gatherer expansions. That matters because Iberia looks less like a blank page repeatedly erased from outside, and more like a deep basin where old human lineages collected, mixed, and survived. The Basque story begins to look less like a fairy tale of untouched cavemen and more like a geological formation, layer after layer, with the oldest visible layer glowing red in the burial of El Miron. The red ochre on her bones is more than a dramatic detail. It tells us that the people of this region had a symbolic world, a ritual grammar of death, and a concern for the dead that crossed the line between survival and meaning. She was not thrown away. She was placed. Her burial was not random debris in a cave. It was a deliberate act in a landscape already saturated with memory. When people speak about the Basques as an ancient people, they often leap straight to language, as if the mystery begins with words. But before words leave any trace, bodies, pigments, tools, and bones show that northern Iberia had already become one of Europe's great human strongholds. The caves of this region were not marginal hideouts. They were archives of identity, places where generations returned, hunted, painted, buried, and remembered. If a language can survive in a mountain refuge, it does so because people first learned to survive there as communities. Then came one of the most important ruptures in human history: farming. Around 7,500 years ago, the Neolithic transformation moved into Iberia. People with ancestry from Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean brought domesticated animals, crops, pottery, new settlement patterns, and new ways of organizing land. In many parts of Europe, farming did not spread as a simple idea adopted by local hunters. It spread with people. Farmers arrived, settled, multiplied, and mixed to different degrees with the foragers they encountered. Under the old Romantic model, the Basques were often imagined as people who resisted this transformation completely, a remnant of pre-farming Europe hiding in the Pyrenees. Ancient DNA overturned that clean image. The Basques are not simply unmixed Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Their ancestry is strongly connected to early Iberian farmers who had already absorbed local hunter-gatherer ancestry. That is the crucial twist. The Basque genetic story is not the story of hunters who refused the farmers. It is the story of a local northern Iberian fusion population that formed after farmers and hunter-gatherers met. This does not weaken the ancient story. It makes it more believable. A people who survived unchanged for 19,000 years would be a fantasy. A population that absorbed farmers, kept a strong local foundation, and later preserved a distinct language and identity in a mountainous Atlantic refuge is exactly the kind of thing real history produces. El Mirón represents the deep hunter layer. Early Iberian farmers represent the Neolithic layer. Later northern Iberian communities represent the regional consolidation layer. The Basques emerge not as cave people teleported into modern Europe, but as the descendants of a fusion population that retained something unusual while others around them shifted more dramatically. Their ancestry was not pure Paleolithic, but their homeland had a Paleolithic depth, unlike almost anywhere else. Their language was not recorded in the Ice Age, but it survived in a region where older population structures had exceptional staying power. The strongest bridge between the Red Lady and the Basques is not a straight genetic line drawn from one skeleton to one modern people. It is geography, continuity, and survival through mixture. Northern Iberia was a refuge during the Ice Age. Then it became a zone where hunter-gatherers and farmers blended. Then it became a region affected by Bronze Age migrations, but not erased in the same way as many other places. Then, during the Iron Age and Historic period, the Basque region held onto a language that did not belong to the Indo-European world. The result is a layered identity with a deep Western European substrate. This is why El Mirón is such a compelling opening figure. She lets the story begin with a body, a colour, a cave, and a place. The Bronze Age brings another dramatic shift. Across much of Europe, steppe ancestry spread with new social systems, new male lineages, new burial practices, new technologies, and Indo-European languages. In Iberia, this transformation was severe in some ways and uneven in others. Male lineages changed dramatically in parts of the peninsula, suggesting strong social dominance by incoming groups. Yet the Basque region remained unusual. Modern Basques do carry steppe ancestry, so they were not untouched by the Bronze Age. But compared with many neighbouring populations, they preserve a profile that resembles Iron Age northern Iberia more closely than the later mixed populations of much of Spain and Portugal. This is one of the most important points in the entire story. Basque distinctiveness does not require a fantasy of total isolation since the Paleolithic. It requires a later historical bottleneck of identity, geography, language, and limited admixture after the Iron Age. The Basques became distinctive not because nothing ever happened to them, but because after a certain point, less happened to them than to their neighbours. That is where the language becomes central. Euskara is not just a curiosity, it is a barrier that likely helped preserve genetic distinctiveness by shaping marriage networks, social boundaries, and cultural memory. Language is not DNA, but over long periods it can influence who marries whom, who belongs, who moves into a community, and who remains outside it. In a place like the Western Pyrenees, with steep valleys, local identities, difficult terrain, and long-standing rural continuity, a non-Indo-European language could act like a cultural wall. Romans could conquer the broader region. Latin could transform Iberia. Celtic and later Romance languages could spread across neighbouring territories. But Euskara survived, and because it survived, it preserved a line of difference that was not only linguistic. The Basques became the people whose language refused to be absorbed, and that refusal helped make their genetic profile unusual as well. This is why the Basque mystery is not solved by saying they are the oldest Europeans and leaving it there. The deeper question is why this particular corner of Europe retained what others lost. Western Europe once held many languages that were not Indo-European. Iberia, before Rome, contained multiple linguistic worlds, including Iberian, Tartessian, Celtiberian, Lusitanian, and others. Most disappeared under Roman rule or earlier transformations. Euskara survived. That survival turns the Basques into a living clue, not because every Basque word descends from the speech of El Miron's people, but because the region preserved an older pattern of resistance to replacement. The language is a survivor from before Latin, before the full dominance of Indo-European speech in Western Europe. Its persistence suggests that the Western Pyrenean population held together with unusual strength through the same historical storms that dissolved other identities. The story becomes even more compelling when one considers the symbolism of the Pyrenees themselves. Mountains are not walls in the simple sense. People cross mountains, traders cross mountains, shepherds cross mountains, warriors cross mountains, but mountains slow history down. They create pockets where local systems persist. They break broad migrations into small movements. They make valleys into worlds. The Basque homeland sits at the meeting point of Atlantic Europe, Iberia, and the mountain corridors between Spain and France. It is open enough to receive influence, but enclosed enough to preserve difference. That is the perfect geography for a population shaped by mixture but marked by continuity. The Basques did not need to be isolated since the Stone Age. They needed enough continuity, enough local structure, and enough cultural boundary to carry an older identity through the Iron Age and into recorded history. The Red Lady of El Miron therefore becomes a powerful figure because she allows you to feel the depth of the landscape before the Basques enter history. She lies in a cave while the Ice Age loosens its grip. She belongs to a world of hunters whose descendants and relatives were folded into later populations. Thousands of years pass. Forests expand. Reindeer retreat. Red deer, boar, cattle, sheep, and wheat enter the story. Farming villages appear. Stone tools give way to polished axes, pottery, and then metal. The old hunter world is transformed but not erased. Its ancestry persists inside the farmers of Iberia. Then the Bronze Age arrives, bringing new ancestry and probably new languages across the region. Still, in the Western Pyrenees, something holds. By the time Rome arrives, the ancestors of the Basques are not Paleolithic hunters in skins, but Iron Age people with farming, metal, villages, trade, and a language unlike the Indo-European speech around them. They are modern enough to belong to history, but ancient enough to defy its usual pattern. This is the real narrative power. The Basques are not interesting because they are untouched. They are interesting because they are layered. They carry farmer ancestry, hunter-gatherer ancestry, steppe ancestry, and later, regional continuity. But their language and genetic profile reveal that the Western Pyrenean population passed through the great filters of European history without being fully dissolved. El Miron gives the story its first light. El Portolón and other early farmer genomes give it its fusion point. Iron Age Iberian genomes give it its historical anchor. Modern Basques give it its living echo. Together they form a chain, not of pure descent, but of place-based endurance. One way to imagine this is to contrast two versions of the story. One version says the Basques are simply cavemen who survived unchanged. Another version says the Basques are the living result of one of Europe's deepest refugia, a population history shaped by Ice Age survival, Neolithic mixing, Bronze Age disruption, and Iron Age preservation. The first version sounds dramatic, but collapses under genetic evidence. The second version is more complex and more powerful because it explains why the Basques look both ancient and not ancient at the same time. They are not a museum display from 19,000 years ago. They are a living population whose roots pass through the same western refuge where El Miron was buried in red ochre. This also changes the meaning of the Basque language. Instead of treating Euskara as a random isolate, it becomes the final survivor of a vanished linguistic ecosystem before Indo-European languages covered much of Europe. There were many older languages tied to many older populations. Most left no written record. They vanished into Latin, Celtic, Germanic, Greek, and other expanding language families. Euskara survived because its speakers survived as a coherent people in a difficult landscape. The language itself cannot be projected cleanly back to El Miron, and no one can honestly claim that her people spoke Proto-Basque. But the fact that a non-Indo-European language survived precisely in this old Western refuge region is not a coincidence to ignore. It is the kind of historical pattern that deserves attention. Geography, ancestry, and language all point toward the same broad conclusion. Western Europe once had deeper layers, and the Basque region preserved one of them longer than anyone else. The most cinematic moment in the story comes when you realize that the Basque mystery is not hiding in one gene or one word. It is hiding in the relationship between a body in a cave and a language still spoken today. The Red Lady's genome tells us that the Western refuge mattered. The early farmers tell us that the hunters were absorbed, not simply erased. The Iron Age evidence tells us that the Basque region became genetically distinctive through continuity after the major prehistoric transformations. Euskara tells us that this continuity was not merely biological, but cultural. None of these pieces alone proves a simple origin story. Together they produce something richer, a Western European survival line that does not run straight, but refuses to break. That refusal is what makes the Basque story so different from the usual ancient DNA headline. Many ancient populations are known only because their bones were sequenced. Their languages are gone. Their names are gone. Their myths are gone. Their descendants are blended beyond recognition into later peoples. But in the Basque case, there is still a living community, a living language, and a recognizable homeland close to one of the greatest refugia of Ice Age Europe. That does not make the Basques fossils. It makes them witnesses. Their existence forces us to remember that Europe before Indo-European expansion was not empty, simple, or silent. It was filled with peoples whose histories were mostly overwritten. The Basques are one of the few cases where something from that older pattern remained visible into the modern world. The truth is not that the Red Lady was Basque. The truth is that she represents the buried world beneath the Basque story. She is the red ochre figure standing at the entrance to the cave, the symbol of a Western refuge where ancient lineages survived the Ice Age. The Basques are the later historical people whose language and genetic continuity preserved a faint but unmistakable signal from that same deep landscape. Between them lie thousands of years of change, warming climates, forests, farmers, herders, metalworkers, warriors, Romans, and kingdoms. Yet the thread remains visible, not a clean bloodline, not an unchanged tribe, a place, a refuge, a language, a memory. And that is why the Basque mystery still matters. It is not simply about where one people came from. It is about how deep history survives after every easy story says it should have disappeared. It survives in mountains. It survives in marriage patterns. It survives in words no neighboring language can explain. It survives in genomes that carry both transformation and resistance. It survives in a woman buried in red ochre 19,000 years ago, and in a people whose language still stands apart on the edge of the Atlantic. The Red Lady does not give us the name of the first Basque. She gives us something older and more haunting. The proof that Western Europe had refugia where human worlds endured. And that in one corner of that old refuge, after the Ice Age, after the farmers, after the Bronze Age, after Rome, something ancient refused to disappear. Thanks for watching, and please like and share if you found this video compelling.